Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome. We are delighted to welcome everyone this morning. It's great to see such a full house here in Weinstein Auditorium. Welcome, my name is Greg White. I'm a professor of government here at Smith College and part of a team, I'm delighted to be part of a team of staff, students, and faculty at Mount Holyoke, Simmons, and Smith Colleges who are organizing a Women in Public Policy Program Institute last week and this coming week. The organizers of the Institute have been honored to have met and spent time with our delegates from around the world. This is a group of 50 women who have traveled to our 3 colleges in Massachusetts to network, work on skill building, brainstorm, and grapple with confronting and challenging issues confronting so-called post-conflict societies. In fact, we've come to grips with the facts that post-conflict is a misnomer. Often, alas, there's nothing very post about conflict. It's very present and ongoing. The delegates seated here down front are a remarkable, inspiring group. Words cannot begin to convey the privilege and the honor it has been to be in your presence for these past 9-10 days since you've arrived. We tend to think of biographies as being very singular accounts of individuals' lives, and that's understandably so. But collectively taken together, your biographies, woven together, demonstrate the power of networked, collective, mutual, social biographies. You all together are a force, individually inspiring with your stories, with your biographies, but collectively, you're awesome. And what I'd like to do is ask our delegates to stand so that we can acknowledge them. Please stand, please rise. Again, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone this morning and introduce this session. In a few moments, I'll turn the microphone over to President Kathy McCartney from Smith College, who will in turn introduce Gloria Steinem. But for members of our audience who might not be that familiar with WPSP, I want to take several minutes to say a few words about the Institute and our delegates. I want to offer some acknowledgments, speak about the arc of these 2 weeks, and contextualize this morning's panel. The WPSP was founded in 2011 by a group of visionary women, including then Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. It was a founding partnership between the U.S. State Department and 5 women colleges, Barnard, Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke, Smith, and Wellesley colleges. But in 3 short years, it has quickly evolved and matured to include more institutions, including our partner for this institute, Simmons College. Other institutions have also joined in: Scripps, Mills, Mount St. Mary's colleges, public institutions like CUNY, UMass Lowell have hosted WPSP institutes, and the Australian government has conducted institutes as well. Shortly after the 2012 election, the WPSP moved out of the State Department and is now housed at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Initially, the institutes were focused on catalyzing and building women leaders in government, but it has usefully and importantly expanded to include the training and networking of women in nonprofit, educational, and civil society sectors as well. All our institutes, all our efforts are very much a part of a broader legacy, a community of women that include delegates from prior institutes, of course, this institute that's happening right now, and what we expect will be many future institutes. Judging from the testimony and reports of delegates from past institutes, it's a powerful movement, and our delegates are now part of it. Our delegates come from a wide array of countries. These are Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Colombia, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Mali, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, Palestine, Rwanda, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Thailand, Uganda, and Vietnam. Yeah, that's it. One of the things that's been apparent in the Institute days thus far at Mount Holyoke and Simmons Colleges is that while we think of ourselves as being from specific countries, yes, of course, we are also often much more than our mere nationalities. In part, it's because one's identity cuts across nationalist identities because of complicated histories, religions, languages, as well as experiences of migrations that people have. So our preoccupation with country identity is very understandable given borders and visas and passports. But it's also so very modern, even late modern perhaps. What we know today as a passport, for example, was only really created in the early part of the last century, just before World War I, and didn't really become what it is today until after World War II with the advent of air travel, of mass air travel. Yet there's a problem with focusing narrowly on country-level contexts and cases, and we've seen that very much this past week. We have to be wary, I think, of a kind of intellectual and scholarly nationalism or even parochialism, where we speak of problems as being unique to specific countries and or only contained within a country. So many of the challenges today are not only common and evident in many, many, many countries and regions of the world, but they're also transnational. And again, we've seen this past week, that it is impossible to talk about problems as if they're national level issues within a country. And it's especially apparent when we talk about arms trafficking, unjust terms of economic trade, deep and powerful colonial legacies, intervention by former colonial powers and or today's superpowers, environmental challenges like climate change, ongoing external support for repressive governments or insurgent movements, powerful news medias, and so on. Put bluntly, rare is the civil war or domestic conflict that doesn't have external intervention or meddling. So therefore, focusing on national level analyses makes some sense, yes, of course. And we have to be sure to hold leaderships in various countries accountable for their actions. And it's clear that the goals of the Women in Public Service Project, building leadership capacity for women from around the world, is at the heart of working to find solutions to conflict. But we have to be ever mindful of the broader context in which countries around the world are enmeshed. As we move into the final portion of this institute, I'm sure we will continue to problematize and think through the many levels at which conflicts operate, especially as we think of strategies for surmounting conflict and achieving justice. By way of acknowledgments, I think it's important to stress again that there's been a large team that has brought this institute together at Mount Holyoke College, Simmons College, and Smith College. I won't presume to list the many, many, many hands that have contributed to this endeavor. And in fact, I encourage you to spend some time on the website. It's www.smith.edu/WPSP, where there's a long list of acknowledgments. I should also add that the website may be on the Smith server, but it's truly a joint website between the three colleges. By way of specific acknowledgments, I want to thank Mount Holyoke College President Lynn Pascarella, Simmons President Helen Drinan, and our own Kathleen McCartney for their support. I also want to take this public opportunity to thank our Mount Holyoke College and Simmons teammates. From Simmons, Linda Connolly, Mary Shapiro, Aaron O'Connor, Nancy DeMauro. From Mount Holyoke College, Karen Remler, Kevin McCaffrey, and Kate Wasserman. And I also want to thank Jessica Burns, who was the executive director of the Bryn Mawr's Institute last summer, 2013, for her work as well. And in terms of the Smith team, I want to take this Smith-based opportunity this morning to especially thank Smith members, Sandy Doucette, Jane Fala, Patrick Fenton, and Iris Navalu. And I also want to give a special shout out to our student ambassadors. We have 4 student ambassadors from each campus, so 12 in all, and they have been, again, awesome and tremendous in their assistance in putting on the Institute. So. A few final comments in terms of the arc of the Institute, the dramatic arc, if you will, where we've been this past week and where we're going in the days to come. We envisioned that the first several days, last week in Mount Holyoke, would focus on examining the myriad issues and problems confronting women in post-conflict societies around the world. And as I said at the outset, we quickly found ourselves discussing the ways in which many societies are in conflict or may even be pre-conflict, anticipating conflict. In turn, we wanted to spend several days turning to building individual skills and capacities, and that was the focus of the days at Simmons College, the last several days over in Boston. And now this morning we make a pivot, we make the turn to the final days of the Institute that will, of course, continue to involve Simmons and Mount Holyoke in terms of planning, but it's here at Smith, and we'll be focusing on devising strategies and solutions for achieving social change. So this panel on activism and change, archives, memory, and strategies for policy reform and personal development is a long title. And it was imagined as a way of bridging into the last several days of the Institute. And we're thrilled, again, this morning to have Gloria Steinem with us. Before I welcome Kathy to the podium to introduce Gloria, I want to say a few final words about the panel. We conceived of this panel in close collaboration with Darcy Berkeley, Professor of History, and Sarah Gold, activists in residence at the Sophia Smith Collection. We are grateful for their efforts and the insights they brought to, that they bring to issues of history, archival work, broadly conceived, and activism. Darcy and Sarah will participate on the panel with Gloria, along with two delegates. You will see on your program Thi Huyen Linh Nguyen, who is with the State Records and Archives Department of Vietnam. And we're also grateful to Maria Salim for accepting our invitation to join the panel as well. Maria is the program coordinator for the Center for Peace Studies, and she is based in Delhi, India. And finally, to explain the format of the panel, after Kathy's introduction of Gloria and Gloria's remarks, we will watch two brief video clips that Sarah Gold has brought for us of women here in the United States who are contending with profound issues in their own communities. It's also part, as Sarah will explain, of the project of recording women's oral histories, and that is now housed, or that is housed at the Sophia Smith Collection, and we'll hear more about that. After watching the clips, we will welcome our 5 panelists to the stage for a panel discussion. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Smith College's 11th president, Kathy McCartney. Kathy's support in her first year for the goals of WPSP has been immediate and committed, and it's fitting that she takes this opportunity to introduce Gloria to you. Thank you very much.
It's really an honor and a privilege to be here this morning. I too want to welcome the delegates. I had a chance to meet some of you last week at Mount Holyoke College, and I'm looking forward to hearing all that you've learned and your plans for networking, both this morning but later this afternoon at my home when I welcome you there. I also want to welcome all the members of the Smith community, some current members and others who are returning that I met on the way in. And I can tell we have people beyond the Smith community, from the Northampton community here, and that's because of Gloria Steinem. So I have the privilege of introducing Gloria to all of you, and I'm so happy to do that. I'm going to start at the beginning. She was born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, and we're very proud that she's a graduate of Smith College. She graduated in 1956. She went on to India, as she told me last night, with a Chester Bowles Fellowship, and that was a life-changing experience for her. She started her career as a journalist, working as a columnist for New York Magazine, and soon thereafter co-founded Ms. Magazine in 1972. And I think, as we all know, she was an editor there for 15 years. She's written numerous best-selling books, including Revolution from Within and Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions. I love that title. She's founded numerous organizations, including the Women's Action Alliance and the Women's Media Center. She has championed a broad view of feminism that lifts up all of humanity, women, men, children, and the disenfranchised from around the world. She's tackled so many issues: abortion rights, sex education, marriage equality, civil rights, civil liberties, anti-war activism, and the protection of children. Not surprisingly, President Obama saw fit just recently, 2013, to award Gloria the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the United States' highest civilian honor. And I thought I would just share a little bit of my personal connection to Gloria, which started long before I met her, because I have a feeling it will resonate with so many of you. I was 17 when I bought my first copy of Ms. Magazine. I used my babysitting money, and I immediately subscribed. Last night at dinner, there were a number of women with the same story. Some of them still have that first copy of Ms. Magazine. I think it's fair to say that Gloria's work raised my consciousness forever, changed me, and I like to say that I found my voice through hers, and maybe some of you feel the same way. We all have our stories about our coming of age with respect to feminism, certainly here at Smith, and I've had the privilege of hearing the stories of many of the delegates. They're powerful narratives that not only move us, but move the world. It's fitting that Gloria is going to lead a panel on storytelling and social change. She's always seen the former as a way to achieve the latter. Through her journalism, her editorial work, and her publishing, she's helped advance so many causes we fight for today. She's done this through her own voice, but also by empowering women to tell their stories and thereby change conversations throughout the world. Conversations on women's rights, on human trafficking, on social justice. Conversations and stories like the one we've been hearing throughout this institute. They need to be recorded, shared, and amplified. Smith is proud to have been part of an effort in a unique way. With Gloria Steinem's help and the help of the Ford Foundation, we've collected the stories of women leaders of social movements and the unsung heroes through the Voices of Feminism archival development project in the Sophia Smith Foundation. The project documents the persistence and diversity of organizing for women in the United States in the latter half of the 20th century. I'm so pleased that Gloria herself chose the Sophia Smith collection as a home for her papers. We're honored to house these resources for women's rights and would like to thank Gloria for helping us collect and share these important voices. Please join me in welcoming Gloria Steinem.
There's a very special feeling in this room today. We represent more parts of the world in a small group than any room I've ever been in. It's never been more clear that we are together on spaceship Earth. Once upon a time, there weren't national boundaries, there weren't lines in the sand. The Earth was organized around migratory paths that covered the globe like lace, and cultures were the most rich and interesting where those migratory paths crossed. I think in many ways we are returning in a new way thanks to technology on the positive side and travel, thanks to environmental dangers and shared personal dangers on the negative side. We are returning to this time of spaceship Earth. But I can speak of my own experience and say that in the women's movement, an umbrella term that comprises every woman trying to survive and use her talents in the world, there has always been an enormous crossing of boundaries. For me, living in India for 2 years after I first graduated from this college, and thanks to a fellowship program of this college, it was the first time I began to realize that women's history was mostly absent from both of our countries. That the patriarchal, the recent, temporary, and soon to be over patriarchal had for something between 500 years on this subcontinent and 5,000, no more than 5,000 years anywhere in the world, which is less, way less than 5% of human history. 95% of human history was often quite different. And it was India that taught me that, because I was traveling with a friend, Devaki Jain, who is a very courageous, well-known writer and feminist whom you may know. And we had decided that it would be important to women's movements around the world if we compiled a small handbook of Gandhian tactics. Since being nonviolent, they were well suited to women's movements around the world. And we studiously went around, gathering his letters, which is mostly the way he communicated, and so on. And finally, we went to see someone I hope you also know, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who's no longer with us, but who is a great, great pioneer and leader. And she sat on her veranda rocking and drinking tea and listening to us. And finally she said, "Well, of course, my dears, we taught him everything he knew." And it's true, as it turns out, that both from his time in England, becoming a barrister, and from his experience in India, he had observed the tactics of the massive peaceful tactics of the women's movement there, striving to overcome many practices, and even during the period of the British. So I think that's symbolic, it was symbolic for me, of how important it is that we both record our own stories now, as we are doing here in the archive, and I hope that you will record your story. Each of our stories is part of the spaceship we are on, and also part of history. And also to honor the ways in which we learn from each other across boundaries. I learned how to organize really from groups on the ground in India who told me certain basic things, like if you want to change how people live, you have to know how they live. If you want people to listen to you, you have to listen to them. Very, very basic ground-up rules. And who taught me by the example of Ela Bhatt, someone I hope you also know, who just received an honorary degree here at Smith, who, as an organizer, gave birth to what has become the single biggest women's union in the world, composed of the poorest women, the so-called self-employed women in India, which means women who sell BDs, cigarettes, or vegetables on the street, or who carry bricks on their heads, and so on. Women who she was told could never possibly be organized. Now there are 1,700,000 women, members of SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, and as we know, it's not only in India, it's in surrounding countries, in Russia, and even in Africa. There was Nawal Saadawi, who I hope we also know. These are my generation women who, from whom I learned. And I know that this group has been discussing the crucial ways that women can negotiate across and surmount armed conflict. And so I'm glad that you've seen Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which is a very important documentary example of women doing that, of Muslim and Christian women organizing together when they were not supposed to do this, against long-standing warlords, and simply saying, enough, enough, and sitting in the road in their white t-shirts and saying enough, enough, for long enough to get the corrupt warlord who was the president transferred to the criminal court, and also to begin to have elections. Actually, I was in Ghana when the women in Ghana who helped the women in Liberia do this explained to me I don't know if this is in the documentary or not, that because there was such destruction in Liberia, when they had the peace conference of all the different warlords to make the preconditions for the election, they were in a hotel in Ghana. And the women's groups from Ghana paid the way of women from Liberia to come so they could be present. The men were staying in a nice hotel and nothing much was happening day after day after day, so finally they surrounded the hotel and wouldn't let them out until they... So I think there are some very basic tactics that we can learn from each other. And Lema Bowie, who you came to know through that documentary, is at the moment in New York teaching at Barnard. So perhaps you could call her into your presence. And there are men too, of course. Dr. Mukwege in the Congo, for instance, who is a great hero, who you might say is to violence against women what Mandela was to apartheid. I mean, there are men of great feminism in a deep, deep sense. But I think we also need to realize collectively that this is a time of great danger as well as great promise. Isn't that the Chinese character for opportunity? That's both danger and promise. And we seem to be very much in that place. Because for the first time that we know of in world history, there has been so much violence against female human beings that there are now fewer females on our spaceship Earth than there are males. It is a first. And it comes, our different countries are responsible for this in different ways. There is the son surplus and daughter deficit that we are familiar with across great swaths of Asia, for instance, and that is destabilizing nations as, say, China steals women from North Korea, or women travel, not always by their own will, from the south to the north of India, and so on. That is one great source, the neglect or even feticide of females is one great cause. In this country, the cause, our contributing cause, is, not just one thing, but in the majority, it is domestic violence. If you added up in this country all the Americans who were killed in 9/11 and in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and then you added up all the women murdered by their husbands or boyfriends since 9/11, the number of women murdered would far exceed the number of Americans killed. And yet we pay much, 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 much more attention to foreign terrorism than to domestic terrorism. Each of us contributes to this, and we need to look at the ways that we do. And of course, the violence against women in conflict zones is also a very clear cause. At the same time, we can demonstrate through scholarship such as that in a book called Sex and World Peace, a book I recommend to you, in which Valerie Hudson and several other scholars have shown that in almost 100 modern countries, the most reliable predictor of whether there will be violence in that country, in the streets, internal to that country, or whether that country will be willing to use military violence against another country, is not poverty or religion or access to natural resources or even degree of democracy, it's violence against females. That is not because female life is more important than male life, but because that is the first violence. It's what we see in our cultures, perhaps in our own families. It normalizes the idea of subject-object dominating someone else, even the necessity of controlling others. It normalizes that false paradigm and projects it off into society. We will never have democratic cultures until we have democratic families. That's what the Irish Peace Women knew. That is our task. So there is nothing literally on this spaceship Earth that is more important than what the delegates here today from so many parts of the world are doing, from what we, hopefully, the rest of us in this room are doing. There is nothing more important. And I think we understand the reason, and if we don't understand, we are being painfully taught by situations from Santa Barbara, where, as perhaps all of you have read, a murderer went on the rampage saying very specifically that he was angry at women because they controlled population in the world, that feminism was evil, and that was his motive for randomly shooting people. And then we have Nigeria, and I'm so grateful that you went to the courthouse and held up your signs, right, saying, "Save our daughters," thank you. Perhaps what's different about that situation is that it's publicized. I mean, this kind of kidnapping, as we know, goes on in many other situations. And it's so clear that they did not kidnap important people, decision makers and so on, who might have been ransomed. No, they kidnapped young women who were most obviously the means of reproduction. Our bodies are the means of reproduction. Authoritarian, violent groups in the world can do many things, but they can't reproduce. And it is that root cause of violence against females that we must be conscious of. In our different ways, in our different cultures all over the world, we are striving to say, we can control our lives from the skin in. We have the power and the obligation and the duty to say, no, we will not be controlled by outside forces. We will decide the fate of our own physical selves. And in that simple, common sense determination, we are doing something very revolutionary. It's seizing control of the means of reproduction. Even sounds radical, doesn't it? Is radical. And now I believe that we have learned, both because we have centers of learning like this campus, and because our adversaries teach us this from Santa Barbara to Nigeria, we have learned that it is all rooted in controlling reproduction. The bias against sexual expression between members of the same sex, the bias comes because it cannot end in reproduction. We are in partnership with all of those groups who are struggling to say that love and connection is not all about reproduction, it is about two human beings. We are in partnership with everyone working against racism of any sort, because wherever there is racism, there is much more motive, a deep, deep motive to control reproduction. You cannot maintain racial difference in the long run without controlling reproduction and keeping races separate. It may affect different women very differently. The women of the so-called superior group may be sexually imprisoned on a pedestal, and the women of the so-called inferior group may be sexually exploited to produce cheap labor. But all women are imprisoned by racism and the motivation to maintain racial separation and therefore to control us as means of reproduction. So, our causes are not separate. The great social justice movements of the world are really interwoven. You can't uproot racism without uprooting sexism and vice versa. Sometimes because I'm on campuses a lot, mostly in this country, but in different countries, and students will say to me things like, well, why are the same groups against both lesbians and birth control? But it's obvious why, because in both cases, it is fighting against the idea that sexuality has any purpose, any moral purpose other than reproduction, which is, of course, a lie about human sexuality. It has always been not only a way we reproduce, but a way we reach out to each other, bond, express loving and caring. So I hope that we are united in this magical room we have here. And I don't know, very hard to know what we will take away that is the most helpful to us. The delegates, it may be nothing we say here. It may be that 2 of you meet, or 6 of you meet, and form a girl gang. We don't know, what is going to be the most helpful. We just know that we are together in this worldview that says human beings are linked. We are not ranked. We are linked to nature. We are nature, and nature is us. And we are linked to each other. I think together we can go back to the old, original 95% of human history paradigm, which was a circle, not a pyramid. And this is our joy and our connection with each other. And this day and this time we have together is part of our reclaiming of Spaceship Earth. Thank you, thank you, thank you.